The dam did not break. Remember that, because everything about this story pulls you toward expecting it to. A giant dam, a full reservoir, a valley of sleeping towns below. But the Vajont Dam held. It is still standing today, more than 60 years later, almost exactly as it was built. That is the horror of it. Nearly 2,000 people died in that valley on the night of the 9th of October, 1963. And the dam that everyone feared never gave way at all. The water went over the top of it, and the thing that pushed the water came down the mountain. High in the Dolomites of northern Italy, where a river has cut a deep, narrow gorge, the power company SAD set out to build something record-breaking. The Vajont Dam was a thin arch of concrete wedged between the walls of the canyon, 262 meters tall, one of the highest dams in the world when it was finished. It was elegant and it was clever, and on paper it was a triumph of Italian engineering. Behind it would sit a long, deep reservoir, and that water would spin turbines and light up the industrial north. It opened at the end of the 1950s to exactly the kind of pride you'd expect. A wall of concrete holding back a lake in the mountains. Proof of what men could do to a landscape when they decided to. The dam was the part they got right. Everything they got wrong was in the ground around it. On the south side of the reservoir stood a mountain called Monte Toc. The name, in the local dialect, carried a warning in it, something close to the walking mountain or the rotten one. The people who had lived under it for generations knew its whole flank was loose, that it moved, that it shed rock. It was not a secret, it was folklore. And when geologists finally looked closely, the folklore turned out to be the truth. The entire side of Monte Toc facing the reservoir was, in effect, an old landslide. A vast slab of mountain, kilometers across, sitting on a weak, clay-slicked bed, tilted toward the water. Fill the reservoir, and you would soak the foot of that slab. Soak it, and it could let go. A young geologist studying the valley worked out the most frightening part. This was not a scatter of little surface slips that could be managed one by one. It was a single enormous mass, an ancient landslide that had come to rest there in some earlier age of the earth, and it was capable of moving all at once. It was not a warning anyone in charge wanted to hear, because there was no engineering answer to a whole mountainside coming down in one piece. So it was noted and filed, and the filling went on. As early as 1959, while the dam was still being built, experts told SAD plainly that the flank of Monte Toc was unstable and could slide into the basin. SAD, in the words of the record, took no notice. The dam was nearly finished. The reservoir was going to be filled. The schedule had its own momentum, and the mountain was an inconvenience. This is the part that should stay with you, because they were not blindsided. They were warned over and over by the mountain itself. In November 1960, with the reservoir partly filled, a piece of Monte Toc, some 800,000 cubic meters of it, slid into the lake. A crack opened along the hillside in the shape of a great M, tracing the outline of the slab that wanted to move. SAD lowered the water and dug a bypass tunnel, so that if part of the slope ever did fall and split the reservoir in two, water could still get past. They were, in other words, already planning around a landslide they knew was coming. They just thought they could manage it. For the next 3 years, they ran the mountain like an experiment. Raise the water, and the slope crept faster. Lower the water, and it slowed. They watched that relationship on their instruments, the whole hillside sliding downhill, a centimeter a week, then more. Local people felt tremors. They heard the ground groaning at night. Animals were said to have left the lower slopes. Then, in the autumn of 1963, the experiment stopped answering the way it was supposed to. In late September, The operators began carefully drawing the reservoir down, trying to ease the pressure on the slope and settle it. But the mountain no longer slowed. The creep that had been a centimeter a week climbed to 10 inches a day. And on the day before the disaster, the flank of Monte Toc was moving a full meter every 24 hours. A whole mountainside, walking downhill at a pace you could almost stand and watch. The men in charge saw the numbers. They had built their careers on this dam. They kept lowering the water and hoped the slope would hold a little longer. The night of the 9th was cold and clear. In Longarone, on the valley floor below the dam, and in the smaller villages strung along the reservoir, Urto, Casso, and the hamlets between, people were going to bed. It was a Wednesday. Nothing about the evening felt like the end of anything. At 10,039, the mountain finally went. The entire flank of Monte Toc, a slab 2 kilometers long, around 260 million cubic meters of rock and earth and forest, broke free in one piece and slid into the reservoir at over 100 kilometers an hour. It reached the water in 20 seconds. In 45 seconds, it had filled the reservoir completely, slamming the lake out of its own basin. The water had nowhere to go, so it went everywhere at once. The impact threw up 3 separate waves. One climbed the far side of the valley and swept up toward the villages of Erto and Casso, high above the lake, water going hundreds of meters uphill, tearing at houses that had always sat safely above any flood anyone could imagine. Another rolled back across what was left of the reservoir. And the third, 50 million cubic meters of water, more than you can really picture, was shoved straight up and over the top of the dam. People who lived through it, up on the high ground, spoke of the sound and the wind before they understood anything else. A roar that filled the whole valley, and a blast of air so strong it broke windows and knocked people down, shoved out ahead of the water by the sheer force of the mountain hitting the lake. Some of them thought, in the dark, that it was a bomb or the end of the world. In a sense, for the valley below, it was. The dam took it. That perfect thin arch of concrete held against a wave 250 meters high going over its crest, and lost only the top meter of its rim. It held. It just no longer mattered, because the water was already falling into the gorge on the other side, toward the town below. What came down the gorge onto Longarone was not really a flood. It was a solid wall of water off a quarter-kilometer drop, with a fist of compressed air pushed out in front of it. The air alone hit the town first, then the water. Longarone was there, and then, in a matter of a minute or two, it simply was not, scoured down to a plain of grey mud and stone, with almost nothing left standing. Survivors and soldiers who arrived at first light described a place where a town of several thousand people had been rubbed off the map, the streets themselves gone. Along the valley, the smaller settlements, Pirago, Rivalta, Villanova, Fay, went the same way. In total, somewhere between roughly 1,900 and 2,500 people died that night. The official figure is 1,907. Only about 1,500 bodies were ever recovered, and half of those could not be identified. Around 30 families lost every single member. No one left to bury them, no one left to grieve them. At 5:30 the next morning, the first soldiers reached the valley. They were Alpini, Italy's mountain troops, many of them local boys who knew these towns, and for days they dug through the mud and the wreckage by hand, searching for the dead in the place where the living had been. Of the roughly 1,500 bodies they eventually recovered, half were so damaged by the water and the debris that they could never be identified, buried, in the end, as unknown. Many hundreds more were never found at all. They are still there, somewhere under the stones, the wave laid down across the valley floor. And above all of it, when the sun came up, the dam was still standing, intact, perfect. It had done its one job flawlessly, right up to the second the reservoir was thrown over its head. What came after was quiet, in a way that should make you angry. There was an inquiry and there were charges, manslaughter, and causing a disaster. But the trial was moved hundreds of kilometers south to L'Aquila, which conveniently put it out of reach of the valley full of survivors who wanted to sit in the room and watch. The sentences, when they finally came, were light. A few engineers, a few years between them. One of them, an engineer named Mario Pancini, killed himself in 1968. The money was worse. A former prime minister took a job leading the legal team for the dam's owners and helped cut the compensation down and helped rule out payment for hundreds of the victims entirely. It was 1997, 34 years later, before the successor company was finally ordered to properly compensate the towns. You can visit the dam now. Since the early 2000s, they've opened it to the public, and you can walk out along the top of that famous curved wall and look down into the gorge, and back at the enormous scar on Monte Toc, where the mountain came off. Behind the dam there's no lake anymore, just the slab of the mountain filling the basin where the reservoir used to be. The dam never failed. That was always the point, and it was never the danger. The danger was the mountain they'd been warned about for years and kept soaking anyway. Until it took the decision out of their hands, and the valley below paid the whole price in a single minute.